So let me just log in into Integration Cloud. So Integration Cloud, as I briefly mentioned before, it's a new solution that has been made generally availability this week. We announced it at Oracle Open World, and this is the venue under which we're going to be able to see dynamic processes. So in this case, we still have the notion of, in the processes canvas, the notion of spaces. So you can create collaboration rooms where you can define process applications. And in my case, I have an emergency room space where I decided to create a new process application. So right here, I already created an ER process, but let me just create a new one from scratch. And this is where we're going to see a difference from the standard PCS functionality. In the past, you were able to create a new process, and that was a traditional BPMN process. But we introduced the ability to create a new dynamic process component. And this is what you'll need to select to trigger off the dynamic process creation. So we're going to create a new process, emergency room process. We're not going to call it ER as we called it before. We're going to provide a quick description. Right now, we start with a particular empty process, but we're going to be adding more templates for this. So stay tuned for that. And when you come in, there's going to be like a tour that is going to be helping you very quickly elaborate on the multiple assets that will allow you to create a dynamic process, like adding activities, adding stages, how you can define the inbound and how you can start a process, how you can send outputs or terminate the process, and then how you can create data objects, roles, and so forth. So we're going to be reviewing this with this an emergency room process as we evolve. So if we take a very simplistic view of somebody having a health issue and having to go into an emergency room, there's going to be two stages that we want to categorize ourselves on, or let's say start with the activity description, where we're going to get a screening and patient activity. Typically, this will be performed by a nurse. There may be like a treatment patient or treat patient activity that will typically be performed by a doctor. There's going to be a discharge patient after he's been screened and probably treated. Again, this is likely to be done by a nurse or some other office practitioner. And then we're going to be adding a new activity that may be surgery, right? So in some cases, after the patient has been screened and has been treated, the doctor has diagnosed that a surgery is an option. And they'll need to probably perform a more specific process before that patient can be discharged. Again, these things are initially mapped as human tasks. But again, as we evolve them, you have the ability to select different activity types. And when you type the name, you can select what is the activity type, and then it's going to be added into this context. So far, these are all activities. We haven't defined any stages. So when the process is deployed and enacted, then all these four will be available to the participants of this process. But we believe this is a little bit too ad hoc. So we'd like to provide a little bit more structure. So we're going to be adding stages, which is the grouping and a notion around discrete steps or activities. And one's going to be the screening stage. So we're going to be adding this one. And we're going to be adding a treatment stage, right? So now it's very easy to bring in this treat activity into the treatment case, this screening. So now these activities will be confined within the scope of execution of the screening stage, and this treat patient will be confined within the treatment stage. So let me just come in here. We're going to change this to just screen patient, so we can do these things very quickly. And then these other ones that, because they are stageless, they can be executed at any time within the life cycle of the process. So imagine this as global activities that will be available for you to perform at any moment in time. So, for example, it may be the case that the nurse has done the screening, but there's no need for treatment. so the nurse can automatically execute the discharge patient activity without having to wait for the treatment as always a mandatory step. So this is a little bit of the things we can implement with dynamic process to implement a more ad hoc flow as you progress with the implementation. So let's assume that we have gotten into some level of agreement with this being the simple flow. Typically, we're going to screen the patient, we're going to treat it, we're going to discharge that individual, and optionally we're going to be doing surgery. So let's come to these activities and drill down into the specific properties for it. So once we click the pencil for edition, we're going to see the properties panel showing up on the right-hand side. What you're going to see as markers are high-level description of the activity behavior, whether you want this activity to be repeatable, whether you want this activity to be required, or whether you want this activity to be manually activated. And these markers are quite important when you start defining the life cycle of these activities within the process. Required and repeatable are pretty trivial, but manually activated defines or gives the knowledge worker the ability to include this activity into the execution plan. So it's kind of like something we're suggesting that they can perform, but it's not automatically activated within the process execution. Sometimes activities may have SLAs from the moment they've been activated, but here we have more control for the end users so that they can define when that SLA trigger can be activated, so that it starts counting when the user takes that discrete manual action. Something that you can also leverage is that the required may be conditional. Only under certain conditions, we want to include this as required. So this is something you're going to be able to include. But let's provide a form implementation for this activity. So we're going to be adding a particular form, which is a patient form that I already created. And this is going to be the screening presentation. So I'm going to be just closing this. We're going to be mapping again this treatment. We're going to be selecting the patient form, but now I have a different selection presentation. There's going to be the treatment, and these forms are visualizing different treatment data elements. We're going to have another one for the discharge, and then we're going to select the patient data, and then we're going to select the discharge activity. And similarly for my surgery, I'm going to be selecting my patient form, and then I'm going to be selecting the surgery form. Okay. So far so good. We created this initial flow. We already bound what screens we want to show when the end user takes action on these discrete activities. But we also want to analyze how we can launch this process. What's my process input parameter? So by clicking on this envelope, we're going to be able to see how this case or dynamic process is going to be created. We can define a data interface, which is going to be like a message start in the BPMN structure world. And you can add arguments that can be scalar values or more composite complex data objects. But in my case, I want to launch this via a form. So I'm going to be saying here it's like start a patient treatment. So this is going to be how we're going to be seeing this within the workspace. Again, we're going to be picking up the form, patient form, but then I'm going to be picking up the start and a presentation, which is only going to be capturing the patient first and last name. And then once this is created, then we're going to be using that for further activities in the process. And then it's asking in which data object I want to hold the values of these forms. So I'm going to leave the default, which is form args, and then it's automatically mapping to this particular data object type or business type. So I'm going to define this, and you're going to see how this automatically changed to another form icon, depicting that the process is initiated with a user form action. So far, it's a message or a form. In V2, we're going to be adding the ability to define multiple entry points. I just wanted to make that a quick clarification for this early stage. So now that we have these data objects defined, we're going to see the input with the form argument, no output or no data processes, but we're going to be reusing this form arg all across our process information. If you think you need more data objects, you can define them by clicking the plus. So this is very similar to how you've been doing it with the BPMN processes. You can reuse that notion of data objects for payloads and enhance the amount of information that you collect and survive through the process life cycle. So let me do one last final thing before we deploy this and see this process in action. And it is the data associations, right? So we're going to be opening these inputs. And we have some input data and then the form that we associated. So I'm going to be running this automatic magical mapping. So it automatically picked that we have a patient information, a patient form on the left-hand side, and this patient form on the right-hand side. So it's able to do that mapping. And then we're going to be doing the same thing for my output because I want to keep track of those values that the end user may have performed. Similarly, I'm going to do for the rest of the activities. So rather than doing these things manually, you can use this new auto mapper capability we added in this dynamic process. And I'm going to complete this again very quickly. Because this can save a lot of time when you are creating and implementing your process. So hopefully these tips are helpful as you start using these new capabilities. This is something we're adding to the data association, so it's going to be equally available in dynamic processes or structured processes. Okay. All right. So process is done. We bound the different activity types, implementations to the different activity types. Sorry. And one last thing before I deploy is that I want to specify who has access to execute these different activities into my process, right? So that can be defined by the roles and a notion. In this case, I could be coming here, and the process owner could be associated to being the doctor, okay? And the doctor will have the ability to have full permission on process. So he's kind of the guard. So you're going to see that as we type this permission name, we can define the scope, which are the items. So in this case, I can be selected in a particular process, full control over the process, or over specific stages or specific activities. So the roles can be very, very specific. So I can define, for example, that the doctor can have full capabilities on the treatment patient activity, but only read-only access when they are discharging. So I can go as granular as I want, in these role definitions, and what's the scope and access that they have through different assets within the process. So I'm going to leave the doctor being the full power, and then once you define the scope of the items, then you can also specify what type of permissions you're enabling this role within this particular asset. So whether you want to enable creation of instances, cancellation or abortion of instances, have view access on the instance, whether you can perform tasks via the update, and some document management access that are associated to the case. So again, this is something that we didn't have in the structure and process world that we're making available to you via these capabilities. So I'm going to say all to subsume everything, and here we go. So I'm going to be renaming the process viewer. I'm going to be calling this nurse, which is our second role. I'm going to be assigning this to the user. I forgot to do that on the previous one. But then I'm going to be saying screening permissions. Screening all permissions to just illustrate these capabilities. So instead of giving the nurse access to the process, I can define access to screening. Instead of view, I'm going to give this person all access. Okay. And similarly, sorry, I'm going to be just adding this user before I forget. And then the other thing is that I'm going to be creating a second permission. I'm going to be calling discharge permission. In this case, I'm going to be selecting the discharge activity, and I'm going to be giving another nurse all permission. Okay. So this is how we can more granularly control the access to all these activities by multiple stakeholders via role and assignment. So I'm going to come to my screen and screening a patient. Again, I'm going to come to my general properties. And probably you've seen these assignees. This is where I'm going to be able to define the access to this activity. You can select from user groups or roles. I'm going to be selecting roles, and in this case, I'm going to be selecting the nurse. I'm going to close this. Then for the patient, I'm going to be defining the doctor as the responsible entity. And then the discharge, I'm going to be assigning this to the nurse. It could be the doctor as well. So we can add multiple roles here if we wanted to. I'm going to put doctor and then role, just to illustrate that this is not a single entity element. And then surgery, which is going to be performed by the doctor, which is something that is more controlled in nature. Okay, so the doctor is the one that can request or trigger the surgery process. All right, so I think we're done in terms of this first level walkthrough and implementation of the process, covering a lot of ground. We've done the stage modeling, we added activities, we have some global activities. We are reusing forms in our project to associate to this user task. We also defined roles and permissions, and then we bounded the roles and permissions to the individual activities. We also defined the way we're going to be triggering the process. So I think we're ready. So we'll do a quick validation just to make sure we're not missing anything. The validation went through successfully. So I'm going to be doing the initial publication, publish V1. So this is going to be synchronizing our changes with the underlying source control management capabilities that come with Process Cloud Service. And now we're going to be deploying this to the runtime engine. Again, this is, let me just refresh this just in case. I'll close this and the activation. What's going on? Let me just launch this again. The publish was done. Try activation. Let me try one small thing which may have got some grief. Okay, it was here. Let me just assign one role only. I didn't try this before, so I'm going to just delete this one. Going to be publishing again. V2. Okay, and some trouble with the activation. But I have already deployed a previous version of the process. So this is just the activation thing that will make it available for runtime. So let me switch hats and move to the workspace interface. So we've seen how the process is model, and we switch it to deployment. So now let's move on to see the workspace interface. You're going to see the typical inbox that is going to be representing the task inbox for end users, where we're pushing discrete activities to the end users. And then we have an initiate request, which is nothing more than the start homepage for starting the process via forms. And then we're going to have two instances lists. So far they are separated, but they're going to be consolidated. One for structured processes, another one for dynamic processes. This is where we can track and trace the in-flight work for cases. But let's move very quickly to my initiate request, where I'm going to see multiple processes already deployed. And one of those is my emergency room process. So as I click here, it's going to be rendering the start form that I mentioned before. I'm going to be just entering Jürgen as my first emergency patient, and we're going to be treating him. And this is submitting this into the ER process. So once this completes, it's going to be creating a new dynamic process entity that is going to be showing up as an ER entry for Jürgen, okay, along with other cases that are in flight for Jürgen in this notion. So in this case, we can visualize things in multiple ways. We can order things via multiple capabilities. But let me just drill down into Jürgen's case in particular. So the first thing you're going to notice is the timeline. Okay, something started October 31st, and today it's been marked as how far along we've moved. We have the ability to visualize the timeline in this milestone-based stage, or also in this other renderization where blue means that it's been executed, then gray means that it hasn't been executed, and green means that it has been executed already. So this will allow you to see which stages have been completed and which ones haven't, which is something that you cannot really see from this timeline. So these two are complementary and quite valuable. So the other thing you're going to see is the activities. So in this deployment I've done, I put some conditionals, as I'll show, because we only have this screening patient. We don't see the treat patient, as we marked before. So in my more evolved version of the process, I define a dependency of treatment being done after the screening has happened. So that's why we don't see the treat patient activity. But then the discharge patient and surgery are global activities that are available at any given moment in time. Surgery is not marked as a mandatory activity, as you can see with this little asterisk. So you're going to see that these two are mandatory, but surgery is an optional task. We're going to be able to see the data associated with the flow so far. We're going to see that we can attach documents. We can see the audit trail so far. And actually, as this complete, you're going to be able to drill down into opening the payload and visualize that. And then obviously the roles, which you can come in and modify so that you can override permissions, assign new users. And this is how the process owner will help control at runtime to change and override the default permissions. This is something only the process owner can do. So, but we are delegating this administrative task to the knowledge worker rather than an administrator. So let's start with the screening. So this is something that we could do from here from the process owner. But I'm going to be clicking on the inbox just to illustrate that every one of those user tasks can also surface as tasks via this interface. So we're going to be executing the patient screening. In this case, we're going to say that Jürgen has a cold, okay, or cold, so it's nothing serious. We're not going to have any surgery with Jürgen today. And then we're going to be completing this task into this task list. As this task completes, then we're going to see that the treat patient activity task was surface. So if I come to my dynamic process and try to see the how far along we are with Jürgen's case, then we're going to see that one of the milestones I added in that more evolved process, and I'll show it to you in a second, has been already completed. So again, this is something that can help the doctor really assess, okay, this patient was admitted October 31st, the screening was completed the same day, so we're at this stage, so now I need to treat Jürgen. So in this case, I can open this form just to show you how we can execute forms either from the task list or directly from this information. I'm capturing the data from the nurse on the previous state, and then provide Tylenol for cold, right? So we can leave everything digitized and documented. We could add comments like in any regular task, and this information will be moved along. And then we're going to be just approving this task so that it moves on to the next step. So as this task executed, we're going to see how this treatment complete milestone was automatically reflected in the timeline. So this is one of the other things that I want to show as I move to the composer interface in just a second. But now, in order to complete this activity, we just need the nurse to complete the discharge. So this is going to be rendering another user interface, and then it's going to be asking for a checkbox to consent that the patient has been discharged. In some cases, you need to read some rights before they are discharged from the hospital, or give them some a checklist. So we need to make sure that we are complying with that. So once this last mandatory activity that was surfaced into the process is completed, then no further milestones were reflected in the timeline. But then from here we can just conclude that this case can be closed. Okay. So again, we're going to be just leaving this case alone. So I just want to go back again to Composer to show you how we added some dependencies in stages and how we added these two additional milestones into our process. So I'm going to be just closing this one process we were modeling. I'm going to be coming into my ER process that I modeled before. And one of the things that you're going to see is that we added these two milestone activities. So the way I've done is I type in an activity name, switch this to milestone. Okay, let's put any dummy name. And then it's going to be moved. Again, you can move milestones around as needed. And then each one will be bound to a specific stage. So when all the mandatory activities in the screening stage were completed, then we want this milestone to execute. And similarly for the treatment, right? But the other thing that you're going to notice is that this stage, for example, has this green marker, that is the activation marker. So if I select this stage and come to my edition properties, and I move to the conditions tab, then we're going to see that there's an activation condition already defined. And in this case, it's defined by selecting the previous stage, or in this case, it could also have been more explicitly by saying screening. If you select a previous stage, it's following the notation of the stage to the left based on a positional placement. If you want to be more explicit, it's always good to show the explicit stage name. Okay. And then we have different event life cycles associated to that asset within the process. In this case, I'm waiting for this stage to complete, and that's what I want to track as a life cycle event to activate this treatment, and then follow the activation for the included activities within the stage. So there are multiple events, not only complete, but when something was enabled, disabled, when the screening stage was created, or other things that are included as part of the life cycle. When you click the help button in this interface, then you're going to have a full depiction of what each one of these life cycle events mean. So we're going to leave this as completing the previous stage. And then you can also add like data-driven conditions that are going to be making reference to different attributes. And then you can add simple data expressions so far. This is one area where we're going to be investing forward, and we're going to be linking these decisions to bound to DMN decisions as well. So just wanted to show you how we can activate that. And then for the screening activities, we're going to say that once the screen patient activity has been completed, then we want this milestone to execute. And similarly, we define that for our treatment complete, where we define that when the treat patient activity is complete, then this milestone will be executed. And that shows a little bit of the additional modeling capabilities that I already showed at runtime for adding conditional activation starters for the different assets, and how we can add milestones along the way. So I'll probably make a pause here. I think we covered a lot of ground in introducing dynamic processes with this live demo across Composer and Workspace. And Jürgen, I don't know if we have any questions on the line, but I'll probably make a quick pause here.
Eduardo, thanks for the excellent introduction in dynamic processes and the modeling capabilities.